The sun was a merciless forge in the sky, beating down on the cracked earth of Arizona territory, with the fury of a god forgotten by time. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow with a sleeve already soaked through, his bay gelding snorting beneath him as they navigated the narrow canyon pass. The heat shimmered off the red rocks like dancing spirits, and the only sound was the rhythmic clop of hooves on stone and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, chasing down cattle rustlers who had made off with half his herd in the dead of night. The trail had gone cold somewhere near Devil's Backbone, but pride and desperation kept him pushing forward. His ranch was all he had left in this world, the last piece of his father's legacy, and he'd be damned if he'd let some two-bit thieves take it from him without a fight. The canteen at his side held maybe 2 swallows of warm, brackish water. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his tongue thick as leather in his mouth, but he'd been in worse spots before, and the nearest town was only a half-day's ride if he turned back now. He could make it. He had to make it. That's when he saw her. At first, she was just a dark shape against the canyon wall, crumpled like a discarded coat in the shade of an overhanging ledge. Jake's horse shied slightly, sensing something amiss, and as they drew closer, the shape resolved into the form of a young woman. She lay on her side, one arm stretched out toward a small pool of water that had long since evaporated, leaving only a white ring of salt and mineral deposits. Jake dismounted quickly, his boots crunching on the gravelly ground. The woman was native, maybe 20 years old, with long black hair that fell across her face like a curtain. Her deerskin dress was torn and dusty, her moccasins worn thin from long travel. But it was her breathing that made his chest tighten with worry, shallow and rapid, like a bird with a broken wing. He knelt beside her, careful not to startle her if she was conscious. Her skin was hot to the touch, burning with fever and dehydration. Her lips were white and cracked, her cheeks sunken. How long had she been out here? How far had she walked before collapsing? "Miss," he said softly, his voice hoarse, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing dark eyes that struggled to focus. She tried to speak, but only a whisper of air escaped her lips. Her hand moved weakly toward where the water had been, and Jake understood immediately. Without hesitation, he unslung his canteen and uncorked it. The last of his water sloshed inside, precious as liquid gold in this wasteland. He should save it for himself, the practical part of his mind insisted. He still had hours of riding ahead, and without water, he might not make it to town. But as he looked down at the dying woman, all those calculations fell away like dust in the wind. He slipped one arm under her shoulders, lifting her gently so she could drink. "Easy now," he murmured, tilting the canteen to her lips. Just a little at first. The water wet her mouth, and she swallowed gratefully, her throat working with obvious effort. He gave her another sip, then another, watching as color slowly returned to her cheeks. When the canteen was empty, he set it aside and eased her back against the rock. "That's all I have," he said, though he doubted she understood English. "But it's yours." She looked up at him with those dark eyes, and in them he saw something that made his breath catch. Not just gratitude, but recognition. As if she had been waiting for him, as if this moment had been written in the stars long before either of them was born. Jake knew he should leave her and ride for help, but something rooted him to the spot. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, or maybe it was the memory of another woman who had needed his help once, long ago, and hadn't received it. His sister Mary, dying of fever while he was away on a cattle drive, too young and too stubborn to wait for his return. Instead, he settled back against the canyon wall beside the woman, his hat tilted down to shade his face. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "reckon we're both in a fix now." The afternoon sun crawled across the sky like a wounded animal, and Jake felt his own thirst growing with each passing hour. His head began to pound, and his vision swam at the edges. But every time he glanced at the woman beside him, she seemed a little stronger, a little more alert. The water had been enough to pull her back from the brink, and that was worth whatever price he might pay. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, the woman finally spoke. "Why?" The word was barely audible, spoken in accented English. Jake turned to look at her. "Why what? Why give water? You need. I am—" She searched for the word. "Stranger." He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "My sister used to say that kindness is the only thing that grows when you give it away. Reckon she was right." The woman studied his face in the dying light. "Your sister is wise." "Was," Jake said softly. "She passed a few years back." Something shifted in the woman's expression, a sadness that ran deeper than her own suffering. "I am sorry. Loss of family is heavy stone on heart." They sat in companionable silence as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The desert air grew cool quickly once the sun disappeared, and Jake noticed the woman shivering in her thin dress. Without thinking, he shrugged out of his leather vest and draped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. "I am called Ayana." "Jake," he replied. "Jake Morrison." "Jake Morrison," she repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "You have good heart, Jake Morrison." As the night deepened, Jake found himself telling her about his ranch, about the cattle thieves, about his father who had built their spread from nothing but determination and sweat. Ayana listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. When he finally fell silent, she began to speak in return. She told him of her people, the Chiricahua Apache, and how they had been driven from their ancestral lands by soldiers and settlers. She spoke of her brother, a warrior named Cochise, who led their band in the mountains to the south. But mostly she spoke of the children, the elderly, the sick ones, who couldn't keep up with the constant movement, the constant running. "I was scouting," she explained, her voice growing stronger as the cool air revived her. "Looking for safe places, water, game. But I got lost, walked in circles for 2 days. When I found this place, I thought I would die here." "But you didn't," Jake said firmly, "and now you won't." She turned to him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. "Because of you. Because you chose to save stranger instead of self." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with fever. "Anyone would have done the same." Ayana shook her head slowly. "No, most would not. Most see Apache and think enemy, think savage. You see person who needs help." The truth of her words settled between them like a stone dropped in still water. Jake had heard the stories, the tales of Apache raids and settler massacres. He'd even believed some of them, if he was honest. But looking at this woman, seeing the intelligence in her eyes and the gentleness in her manner, those stories seemed like shadows cast by fear and ignorance. As the night wore on, Jake's condition worsened. The lack of water was taking its toll, and he found himself swaying where he sat. Ayana noticed immediately, moving closer to steady him with surprising strength. "You are sick," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Because you gave water to me." "I'm fine," Jake protested weakly, but even as he said it, the world tilted dangerously around him. Ayana helped him lie down, using her hands to pillow his head. In the starlight, he could see her lips moving in what might have been prayer or song, the words in a language he didn't recognize, but that somehow soothed him anyway. "Sleep," she whispered. "I will watch." Jake wanted to protest, to insist that he should be the one keeping guard, but his body betrayed him. His eyes closed of their own accord, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of water and desert winds. He woke to the sound of voices speaking in Apache, low and urgent. Dawn was breaking over the canyon rim, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Jake struggled to sit up, his head spinning with the effort, and found himself surrounded by a dozen native warriors on horseback. For a moment, fear gripped him. He was alone, weaponless, and weak from dehydration. If these men meant him harm, There would be nothing he could do to stop them. But then he saw Ayana rise from where she had been sitting beside him, and the look of joy that crossed her face told him everything he needed to know. She spoke rapidly in Apache to the lead warrior, a tall man with graying hair and scars that spoke of many battles. The man's eyes never left Jake's face as she talked, and Jake found himself holding his breath, waiting for judgment. When Ayana finished speaking, the warrior dismounted and approached Jake slowly, his hands empty and visible. When he spoke, it was in heavily accented but clear English. "My sister tells me you gave your last water to save her life," the man said. "This is true?" Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. The warrior studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "I am Cochise. Ayana is my blood, and you have given her life back to our people. This makes you brother to us." Jake grasped the offered hand, feeling the strength in the warrior's grip. "I only did what anyone should do." Cochise's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "No, what you did was show honor when it cost you everything. This is not common thing, especially between our peoples." One of the younger warriors had dismounted and was offering Jake a water skin. Jake drank gratefully, feeling strength flow back into his limbs with each swallow. As he drank, Cochise continued to speak. "For many seasons, there has been bad blood between Apache and White Eyes. Much killing, much pain on both sides, but you have shown us that not all white men see us as enemies to be destroyed. This is gift more precious than gold." Jake wiped his mouth and handed back the water skin. "I've heard the stories about your people, but stories and truth ain't always the same thing." "Truth?" Cochise nodded approvingly. "You speak wisdom. Stories grow in telling like shadows at sunset, but actions show true heart." As the sun climbed higher, Jake learned more about the band of Apache that had found them. They were part of Cochise's larger group, living free in the mountains and desert, avoiding the reservations where the government wanted to confine them. It was a hard life, constantly moving, constantly watching for soldiers, but it was their life, lived on their own terms. "We were searching for Ayana," Cochise explained as they prepared to leave the canyon. "When she did not return, we feared the worst. Finding her alive, finding her saved by one who could have been enemy, this changes things." Jake was helped onto one of the spare horses, his own gelding having been gathered by the Apache warriors. As they rode toward the mouth of the canyon, Ayana guided her mount alongside his. "My brother speaks truth," she said quietly. "What you did yesterday will be remembered by our people for generations. But more than that," she paused, seeming to search for the right words in English. "You showed me that kindness still exists in this world. That is gift I will treasure always." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the cool morning air a blessing after the brutal heat of the previous day. Jake found himself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing it not as empty wasteland, but as home to people who had lived here for countless generations. The Apache moved through this terrain like they were part of it, reading signs in the rock and sand that Jake couldn't even see. As they crested a rise, Jake's ranch came into view in the distance, the building small and vulnerable-looking against the vast expanse of desert. Smoke rose from the chimney, which meant his foreman Pedro was still there, probably wondering where the hell Jake had gotten to. Cochise called a halt, and the group of warriors gathered around their leader. They spoke in Apache for several minutes, their voices serious and thoughtful. Finally, Cochise rode over to where Jake waited. "We part ways here," the warrior chief said. "But before we go, I want to ask you something. The men who stole your cattle, you were chasing them when you found Ayana?" Jake nodded, surprised. "How did you know about that?" "We know many things that happen in our territory. These thieves, they are not from your people. They are Mexican bandits led by a man called Herrera. Very dangerous, very cruel. You know where they are?" Cochise's eyes glittered with something that might have been satisfaction. "They camped last night near Skeleton Creek, about 10 miles south of here. They think they are safe because they cross into Mexico soon, but they did not know Apache were watching." Jake felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. "Why are you telling me this?" "'Cause you showed honor to my sister when you could have left her to die. Honor deserves honor in return." Also, Cochise's expression grew darker. "These bandits have raided Apache camps too, stolen horses, killed old ones who could not run. They are enemies to both our peoples." As the Apache prepared to leave, Ayanna approached Jake one last time. In her hands, she held a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. "This is medicine bag," she explained, pressing it into his hands, "made by my grandmother, blessed by our shaman. It will protect you from harm and bring good fortune." Jake felt the weight of the small bag, understanding that he was being given something sacred, something precious. "I can't take this. It should stay with your people." Ayanna smiled, and for the first time since he'd found her, the expression reached her eyes. "You are my people now, Jake Morrison. Brother to Apache, friend to all who know the meaning of honor. This is your place in the world." Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his cheek, a kiss as light as butterfly wings. Then she was pulling back, mounting her horse, and riding away with the others. Jake watched them go until they disappeared into the shimmering heat haze, then turned his own horse toward home. The medicine bag hung heavy around his neck, a reminder of the most extraordinary day of his life. Pedro was waiting in the yard when Jake rode up, his weathered face creased with worry. "Jefe, where have you been? I was about to ride out looking for you." "Long story, amigo," Jake said, dismounting carefully. His legs were still shaky from the ordeal, but he felt stronger than he had in years. "But first, gather the boys. We're going to get our cattle back." That afternoon, armed with Cochise's information, Jake and his ranch hands rode south toward Skeleton Creek. They found the bandits exactly where the Apache chief had said they would be, camped in a grove of cottonwoods, with Jake's stolen cattle grazing nearby. The recovery was swift and decisive. Caught by surprise and outnumbered, Herrera's men surrendered without much of a fight. Jake's cattle were returned unharmed, and justice was served without bloodshed. As they drove the herd back toward the ranch, Pedro rode up beside his boss. "Something different about you, Jefe," the old cowhand observed. "You seem, I don't know, more peaceful somehow." Jake touched the medicine bag under his shirt and smiled. "Just learned something important, Pedro, about what really matters in this life." That evening, as Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, he found himself thinking about Ayanna and her people. Somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, they were making camp, sharing stories around a fire, living free despite all the forces arrayed against them. He thought about the water he had given her, how it had seemed like such a small thing at the time, but had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined. One act of kindness had bridged a gap between two worlds, had shown him that the divisions between people were often more imaginary than real. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake made a decision. Tomorrow he would ride into town and speak to the sheriff, tell him about the Apache band living peacefully in the mountains, not to betray them, but to vouch for them, to stand as witness to their character and humanity. It wouldn't solve everything. The larger forces of government and greed and fear would continue to push against the Apache and all the other tribes being driven from their homes. But maybe, just maybe, one voice speaking for understanding instead of violence could make a difference. The medicine bag seemed to grow warm against his chest as Jake rose and went inside. In the morning, he would begin a new chapter of his life, one guided not by the old stories of conflict and hatred, but by the simple truth that kindness, like water in the desert, was precious beyond measure and grew more powerful when shared. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying with it the sound of distant drums and the promise of dawn. Jake Morrison slept peacefully that night, knowing that he had found something more valuable than all the cattle in Texas. He had found his place in the great web of humanity, connected to all people by the invisible threads of compassion and hope. And in the mountains to the south, around fires burning bright against the darkness, the Apache elders told a new story to the children gathered at their feet. It was the story of a white cowboy who gave his last water to a dying woman, and how that single act of grace had proven that even in the harshest wilderness, the human heart could bloom like flowers after rain. The story would be told for generations, growing in the telling as all good stories do, but its heart would remain unchanged. That kindness is the only currency that matters, and that love, in all its forms, will always find a way to bridge the spaces between us.